Good morning. My name is Cindy Aronson. I'm the director of the Latin American program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And along with my colleague Ralph Espak of the Center for Naval Analysis, I'm delighted to welcome you to this topic, this very challenging topic that will be the subject of our seminar today. Earlier this year, in the month of May, dozens of gunmen entered a farm in the Petén province in Guatemala and murdered and decapitated 27 people. The authorities have blamed the Zetas. The case is still under investigation, and the assumption is that the Zetas have been increasingly active in Guatemala and in other parts of Central America. The massacre served to underscore the vulnerability of the civilian population in unsecured border areas between Mexico and Guatemala, where narcotics and human trafficking and other forms of organized crime flourish. These activities pose a growing threat to governance as well as to human security in Guatemala and other parts of Central America. The region has become strategically important for the international drug trade because of its geographical proximity to North American drug markets and existing criminal networks with experience moving contraband and laundering money, and also the abundance of weapons from the region's many armed conflicts. In addition, as we have seen over and over again with the balloon effect, the efforts at the success in disrupting Colombian trafficking routes through the Caribbean and into Miami, along with the demise of the most important drug trafficking cartels in Colombia, that of Cali and Medellin, pushed the drug trafficking routes elsewhere. Organized crime takes advantage of the region's weak and fragile institutions, and as we know, it exacerbates the already staggering levels of homicides that have converted the so-called Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, into the most violent region of the world outside of countries formerly at war. So we're pleased to partner with the Center for Naval Analysis in discussing their report, which I believe, Ralph, has been published or is about to be published.
It's in draft form.
In draft form, but will soon be available, on the impact of drug trafficking on 3 border communities in the Guatemalan departments of the Petén, Zacapa, and San Marcos. The report, which I've been able to read in draft form, examines not only the institutional weaknesses that have allowed drug trafficking to flourish, but also the impact on the civilian population living in these border communities. I'll introduce briefly our panelists and welcome them, and then turn to Ralph for an overview of the report. Our first speaker, Ralph Espak, is the director of the Latin American Affairs Program at the Center for Naval Analysis. He's also a senior researcher for the Military Advisory Board on the strategic implications of the shift in the United States to alternative fuels. Among many Ralph's many distinctions, he is a former staff member of the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center, a dear and longtime colleague, the author of numerous books on environmental issues, on international relations, the strategic dynamics of trade. He has a PhD in political science from the University of California at Berkeley. Our next speaker will be Julie Lopez, a reporter with Plaza Pública, an online publication in Guatemala, someone who has specialized in the reporting, the very courageous reporting on questions of organized crime and drug trafficking. Julie is the author of the Guatemala chapter in a report that we had hoped to have back from the printer today, but we'll have next week, from the Wilson Center on the dynamics of organized crime in Central America. She has 2 MAs, one in international relations from the University of Kent and an MA in journalism from the University of Maryland, and she is a current grantee in the joint fellowship program between the Wilson Center and the Washington Post. Next, we will hear from Chris Ash. Chris, welcome back to the Wilson Center. He is the director of the State Department's Office for Central American, for the regional, the Central America Regional Security Initiative within the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, Office of Central American Affairs at the State Department. He coordinates not only the activities of the State Department, but also participates and coordinates interagency planning for U.S. Programs devoted to improving citizen security and combating organized crime. He has served in embassies in Jakarta, in Helsinki, Finland, and has had a variety of jobs in and out of government, including the Central Intelligence Agency, the U.S. Postal Service, as well as a number of defense and management consulting firms. Our last formal speaker on the panel is Werner Ovalle, who is currently the coordinator of the Central American Border Security Program, known by its initials CEFRO, of the System for Central American Integration, SICA, which is the principal regional body coordinating on security issues. Werner has a BA in Law and Social Sciences from the Universidad Rafael Landívar in Guatemala. He also has a master's in public security and in politics from the Universidad Galileo, also in Guatemala. He has 10 years of experience on serving in various Guatemalan institutions on national security issues, and prior to taking his post at SICA, he was an advisor to the technical secretary of the National Security Council of that country. During the discussion period, we'll also welcome the participation of two other distinguished researchers and analysts from Central America who have contributed to the report of the Center for Naval Analysis, Javier Melendez of Nicaragua, and Daniel Herring of Guatemala, if I'm not correct. Okay, Ralph, I'll turn it over to you for your opening presentation, and then we'll take the panelists in the order that I've described. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I definitely want to thank Cindy, Eric, Adam, and the rest of the team here at the Latin American program. It's always great to be here at the Wilson Center. It's such a great place to come to. It's a great venue and always has a great audience too. And I want to thank the audience, in particular all of you coming out this morning to share this time with us and to learn about our research. And I have to be perfectly honest, our objective, my objective and the objective of the co-authors, Danny and Javier, this morning is not just to provide you with this information and inform you with our thinking of what we found, but also to learn from you through your comments and your questions, because as Cindy mentioned, our paper is in the final draft version. It'll be ready by the end of the month. And so the types of questions and especially the ideas that are raised, we hope to turn into a function of improving the paper itself as a result. So we thank you for joining us this morning. I expect we will send out copies of the final draft in English or in Spanish or both to everyone who's on the mailing list today, who came today. But if you want to be sure to be on that mailing list and to get a copy, please be sure to give me your copy of your card or an email so that I can have it and be sure that you're on that list, please. Or you'll be able to download it at the website of www.cna.org. That is at the end of the month. So I'm going to try to be very brief for my presentation this morning of about 20 minutes. We're just going to be compiling 72 pages of report into 20 minutes to give you just an idea of the case studies, of what we found and some of our key findings, and then pass the word to our distinguished commentators, whom I want to thank as well for joining us today. They're a lot of very busy people, and we're very lucky to have them here this morning. So with those thank yous, I'll get on with the presentation. So first, a word of background about the project. This is a particularly a collaborative project between Center for Naval Analyses and the Ibn Khaldun International Research Center at the University of Francisco Marroquin in Guatemala City. I want to give special thanks and a lot of credit to Daniel and his team for doing much of the ground research and the in-depth the data collection in country upon which our findings and our research is based. This project originated through some conversations I had with Javier Melendez about, starting a year and a half or a couple of years ago, about the concept of ungoverned space and how it was being applied to the border regions in Central America. At that time, largely theoretically, coming through kind of counterinsurgency theory, et cetera, and it was being thought about as addressing these countries. And Javier at the time was working in Managua for the IEP, and he was conducting a research on border and coastal communities in Panama, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua, which was focused on the impacts and the ways these communities interact with drug traffickers. And we thought that, what is lacking from a lot of the research and a lot of the vision, a lot of the policy making at that time, or the thinking about policy, was sort of an understanding and appreciation that there are real communities. These ungoverned spaces are very complex. They have governance of their own forms, and there didn't seem to be a lot of information about that. So that was kind of the initiation of this project, and that's why we chose to focus on border communities. It was originally intended to be a project that would cover several countries, and we still hope to do so. But for the time being, we've finished a first tranche, let's say, of 3 communities in Guatemala. So the report itself and the summary I'm going to present this morning really examines 3 cases and then talks about them in a comparative way to reach some key findings about, general findings about border region or border communities, let's say, in general. And we chose our 3 cases in Guatemala upon a range of criteria. We wanted to capture variation across different factors. These are 3 cases then. The 3 cases are Sayache in Petén, Gualan in the department of Zacapa, and Malacatan in San Marcos. And these 3 cases are, as you can see from the map, in 3 different, let's say, economic zones of the country that have different trade ties and agricultural production patterns in each municipality. They are different degrees of, say, isolation from the federal government and from the other major cities around them, and different degrees of development in terms of urban and rural and the type of investment that's gone on in these communities. They also differ in that they are located on different routes, different major drug trafficking routes and other trafficking routes in Guatemala that are under the control of different types of criminal organizations or different specific criminal organizations. So we see up here Sayache is right in the middle of the region that Cindy was mentioning that is considered now largely under the control of the Zetas and their local partners, and where the Zetas are operating. Zacapa is down here in an area where the local trafficking rings are associated largely with the Lorenzana family and their partners is still largely in control of those trafficking routes, very key trafficking routes out of Honduras. And then down here in San Marcos is an area where traditionally the Sinaloa group has been most active in close cooperation with very kind of strongly entrenched local trafficking groups, as we'll describe. So the first case, the next 3 slides, I'm going to go over the 3 case studies very quickly. And this does little more than just kind of provide a snapshot, or let's say maybe a narrative of each case and some of the kind of the key patterns that we see and what we find most interesting about these cases before we come out at the end to our key findings and recommendations. And for any of these cases, we look forward to the questions and answers kind of going into more detail on any question you have, and Danielle and Javier are here to also enter their thoughts and insights from their experiences as well. So Sayache is the poorest, most rudimentary, and certainly the most isolated case that we looked at. Sayache, again, is on the west side of Petén, on the Rio de la Pasión, on the Passion River that leads straight into Mexico. It is the population of Sayache is remarkably heterogeneous and has a strong indigenous component. In fact, recent last few weeks, they elected their first indigenous mayor, which is unusual in that area. The population is heterogeneous, and that is ethnically heterogeneous, and is also relatively transient across our cases. I mean, in Sayache, a lot of the families have come in, a lot of the population have arrived in the last 10 years, even the last few years, looking for cheap land, looking for labor. A lot of them are subsistence farmers, and they will work for a while and work the land until they can no longer work it and then go seek cheap land elsewhere in the Petén. So you have that sort of a social structure. Subsistence agriculture and trafficking have long been important economic activities in the region, but recently, in the last 6 to 8 years, African palm plantations have come in, especially in the south end of the municipality, and bought up a lot of the land and are now key employers in the area as well. The other major landowners, other major sort of economic activity, are large ranches that extend through the north of the municipality up along the border, and this is very common throughout Petén, of ranches that are purportedly for cattle or livestock raising, and it's hard to really understand what's really going on in there because you can't go in, and it's an area that largely considered through interviews and through local police, et cetera, is largely considered owned by trafficking or used by traffickers to get across the border. It's hard to find cattle. There's little evidence of actual cattle production, cattle sales on the scale that would be reflected if this were actually land that were being in that sort of used in that way. One of the interesting anecdotes we came across was of a fiscal officer in Sayache who said that it's interesting. You can see, you can get a feel for who is a drug trafficker in the region because they're the ones who are actually paying the taxes. Because the local Guatemalan who just owns the land and is using it, but he'll just evade the taxes and dare you to come out and try to chase him down and see what's going on there, etc. But the drug traffickers tend to actually pay because they don't want to have any pretense for the government to actually give any trouble. So you can kind of have a sense, but of course there's no way of knowing that that's the case. The most important part of the Sayache example or case study is that Sayache, relative to the other two cases, has the lowest reserve of what we'll call social capital, which is an important factor or variable in our study. When we say social capital, we're referring to is the capacity of the community for social organization and public mobilization along or in pursuit of collective goods. So in Sayache, because of this transience of the population, because of its heterogeneity, because of the weakness of the churches, and there very little presence of churches relative to the other two cases, little presence of NGOs and associations, the community councils and the municipal councils are relatively weak. It's kind of stagnant. They haven't had new leaders, some of them for 15 or 20 years. And because of that, in Sayache, the pattern is that the drug traffickers that operate in the region, the Zetas and their local partners, tend to operate there more through an arm's length transaction sort of relationship with the local community. You don't see the type of investment in the community, the type of co-optation of local institutions that we see in some of these other cases. It's more a sense that the drug traffickers don't feel that they need to do much for the community because the community doesn't provide any sort of a threat to them that they need to co-opt or need to and they're not interested in doing so. As we mentioned, this is Zeta-controlled territory, so the Zetas also bring their own particular dynamic in the way that the Sinaloa cartel and the local traffickers don't operate. The Zetas, as you're probably aware, are well known for relying on violence, say terrorist tactics or kind of sensational violence to cow local communities and local police, et cetera, into cooperating or turning the other way and not engaging them to try to stop their operations. This is just I include this because this is a sign that that the research team took a photo of that I like a lot and might make the cover of the paper. As a person trained in political science in the U.S. in the early 2000s, for me, I'm almost always turning to institutional history, institutional factors to explain politics and social organization and the kind of social outputs you see. And so when I see a sign that says institutions are not allowed in this land, it's a nice emblem of ungoverned space, if you will, and kind of a curious sign. It was explained that for the local Guatemalans, this means government stay out, NGOs stay out, international organization, anyone has any sort of professional affiliation stay out of this land. And that just that means institutions are generally not welcome. Our second case is Gualan on the border or near the border with Honduras. And Gualan is a traditional community in a conservative, say, frontier-style region in East Guatemala. It's similar in many respects, I think, from an American viewpoint to South Texas. People carry, except more so, maybe an exaggerated form, people carry guns openly. Violence rates tend to be very high in Gualan, not just surging in recent years, but also before then and throughout the Zacapa province, Zacapa department. And there is a disdain for the federal government and for intervention from outside. Gualan has always been a trafficking region and an agricultural region, though not a particular fertile agricultural zone. But in recent years, first of all, in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, money started coming in, increasing money started coming into the community from remittances from members of the community who had gone to the United States because of agricultural crises in the 1990s. But then more recently, in the last 5 to 6 years, there's been an inflow of resources and investment, in particular in the tomato industry. New irrigation systems that have allowed a lot of the land now to grow tomatoes for export, and that's what much of the land is being used for today around town. As in Sayache, government officials, public officials interviewed, and people on the street assume that to a great extent, this money that's behind the tomatoes, that's behind the new construction, that's behind some of the new retail that's popping up is tied to money laundering, tied back to drugs. It's very difficult to prove that, but as one official put it, these would have to be golden tomatoes, or tomates de oro, to explain the kind of money they're seeing sloshing around the town now that is sort of changing life in Gualan. In Gualan, there's a group called, that they referred to as Los Señores, who wield a lot of influence over local economic activity, local politics, and security in the street. This is a group of local landowners and businessmen associated with either part of the criminal organization themselves or associated with criminal organizations and with their network. They serve as a form of shadow government behind the municipal government, and it is widely viewed that you cannot engage in economic activity. The municipal government does not function. Things don't function without the señores sort of say so, or checking with the señores. The police avoid confrontation with the señores and say that the señores aren't so bad because they stay to themselves, they do their trafficking, they don't really mix with the community too much, and when they do, it's to give money for the schools, give money for the football team, the soccer team, etc. And so as long as we don't touch them, they don't touch us, and we can sort of coexist. And what one police official said is, what we don't like is when we get orders from the federal government to go out there and seize a shipload or a truck or sort of get engaged, because the retribution will come back against us in the following weeks. And then the federal government has nothing to do with it. So they really would rather the federal government just stay away and not tell them to engage with the señores, because it's a lot more peaceful that way. To the public will say, or at least the interviews tend to reflect a feeling of acceptance of the señores, certainly recognition that señores involved in bad activities and that drugs and the other trafficking is not welcome in particular, but that the prosperity is certainly welcome, and that the señores do provide a level of security that they don't have in many big cities in Guatemala. For example, there is this anecdote that we heard over and again about delinquents or gang members that came into town a year ago or so and started extorting local businesses, and then a curfew was put in place by the señores, and then within a week or two the bodies were found on the outside of town, and they haven't had any trouble with these outsiders coming in here and stirring up the kinds of problems you see in Guate and the big cities around Guatemala. It doesn't happen here in Gualan because of the señores. So is there pattern of the public services in terms of security provided by these criminal organizations? And Julie and I, Julie's kind of commented on our draft paper that this is a form of monopolization of violence by the criminal organizations, not a security service at all. But it's seen locally. It's what we're trying to draw attention to. It's a big problem when the public sees, well, the drug trafficking. We wish the trafficking wasn't there, but it is bringing prosperity into the community, and it provides some level of security. And we don't have much faith, if any, that the national government or the national police could do any of these things for us. That poses a profound challenge in terms of interagency action to try to increase government presence or replace these structures that exist at the local level. Our final study is Malacatan in San Marcos. Malacatan is the most developed case, let's say, of the three that we've examined. There are several major export crops that are grown nearby. It's a relatively fertile, well-developed, and historically rich area of the country. One of the major crops nearby is coffee, for example. This gives the local economy a lot of diversity, a lot of industry associations, and a lot of capacity in that way that the other economies in Gualan and Sayache don't demonstrate. It also has several large churches, has a very active Catholic church presence, and a very active single priest who's very popular in the region and sort of mobilizes the public on various issues. There are public protests against nearby policy and nearby government programs, etc. The comudes and calcodes, the municipal councils, the city councils have regular turnover in leadership. They are active. It's sort of it's a more developed, wealthier, and high employment area relative to the other two cases. And as in Gualan, there's a primary identifiable criminal group, at least when we were doing this research up to a few weeks ago, that is in charge, that is reputed to be in charge of the local trafficking and drug business in and around Malacatan, which is the network around the figure of Juan Chamale Ortiz. Chamalé is a very interesting guy. He's a reverend in a local church, kind of a local boy made good, who was a local farmhand, who then rose over the years to become one of the top, to become the top leader of the local criminal organization, and a big benefactor around the community for churches in particular, but also for all kinds of community functions, etc. He's a member of the community. People will say he gives back to the community, he takes care of the family. He takes care of families that are members of his church and that work for his family. He also has legal businesses that employed various people in small communities nearby. So he's an interesting figure. And when he was arrested last spring by the Guatemalan government for drug trafficking, I believe it was 4,000 to 5,000 people were estimated were taken to the street and threatened to march to Guatemala to demand his release. But that there was an interesting sort of narrative about that in their talks to the media, that he was a local Guatemalan who was doing things for the community, and here the Americans and the Mexicans models are here working with the Guatemalan government, going after our good Guatemalan people, and we don't need foreigners to come in and tell us what to do, and we should release Chamalé right now. Since his arrest, they have found numerous drug processing facilities in the area, which indicates that in cooperation or in the services to the Sinaloa cartel, Chamalé and his group were doing more than just trafficking, which is the usual pattern in Guatemala, that the drug trafficking are largely traffickers. So there was and probably is still with this group sort of a deepening relationship with Sinaloa and working their way up the supply chain, say, or the production chain of drugs. As in the other cases in Malacatan, drug trafficking has increased local laundering and local revenues, but it doesn't seem to have increased violence or other negative impacts on the street, as you see in some of these other cases. This seems to be because the criminal activity is partially dispersed among a much larger economic community. And it's a smaller share of the local economy. It's a smaller share of the people involved. And there is also another component to this, and that is a relatively effective and popular mayor and municipal government that locals call El Conciliador, who's been re-elected, because he is seen as rather successful at bringing together these various industry groups and associations and managing affairs in the city, and that includes, to some degree, Chamalé and his network as just another sort of interest group in the overall town. So in this case, the mayor's office, relative to the other cases, seems to be more independent, more active. This is a photo of the mayor's office, has more resources, it doles out more resources, and is more independent of the drug trafficking money. So I'll quickly go over these key findings. I've already mentioned several of them. Basically, the first one is the border communities. Contrary to what you'll see in some writing, and contrary to some of the theory about ungoverned spaces, these are thriving economically in large part because of rising proceeds from drug trafficking and the need of the traffickers to launder money locally and to build services both for themselves, but then spill over into public services. In Sayache and Gualan in particular, this economic growth is having a very visible impact, even on very isolated populations very close to the border, outside of the main town, but out there near the border. School professors. First of all, there's a proliferation of private schools that are popping up in Sayache, and especially in Gualan. Professors and school administrators say that they now see more and more of these students coming out of these tiny aldeas, these tiny communities that are very isolated outside of town. Now these guys have motorbikes and trucks that the kids come in and actually attend school. They didn't used to see kids coming in from those types of communities. There are private doctors now who say, I will go to those communities now, I'll make visits to those communities because they can afford to pay. They didn't used to be able to afford to pay, and now there's more money out there than there is in staying here in my office and waiting for them to come to me. The second finding, there's really no surprise, is that the community in which there is the capacity for social collective action is highest and best demonstrated. And there is a diversity of actors, and especially in Malacatan, when it is combined with an active municipal government that seems to be relatively independent of corruption, you see the greatest resilience and the least negative effect in terms of violence from the drug trafficking in the community. And then finally, sort of this last bullet point, in each community, people interviewed expressed grave concern that these traditional criminal networks and the traditional relationships that exist between the Los Señores, so Chamalé and his group in particular, may be destabilized and may be overtaken or under threat from the Zetas in particular, but from the Mexicans sort of more generally, that these outside groups could come in, take over, and when they take over, we have real problems. I think it was Gualan, which the expression came out, we heard several times, hay los narcos buenos y los narcos malos. And we are the local narco traffickers. At least we know them. They know us. They give to the community. They don't mess with us more than they need to. And in fact, they take care of us on some occasions to some degree. And given our condition with the federal government and how Guatemala is, maybe that's best for the time being. Because, boy, the narcos malos, when they get in here, things are going to be much worse. And this poses a challenge, of course, to the government to come into these communities and to try to reinsert itself and try to reintroduce services and, of course, the provision of security at some point, but also opportunities from a nationalist viewpoint of, well, this is sort of sentiment around which the government, local municipal authorities sort of can mobilize dialogue and citizen interest in security. To wrap up, in the report, we then derive from these findings various ideas that we lay out on the table that should be considered, we think, for the Guatemalan government and their partners as they consider trying to efforts for improving security here in these border regions. First, we describe various ways of trying to improve social capital reserves at the community level. And these take the form, for example, of the promotion of citizens projects, especially projects or programs that bring together different industry associations, different church groups around a public service objective or message to bring together these different groups to improve trust and dialogue across the community. Cultural events, fairs, these sorts of things that kind of bring the people together and can build the sort of social capital that we see as being more effective in some areas than others and limiting the negative effects of drug trafficking. Second, we describe the potential for measures for creating an interagency and public-private committees at the regional level that would coordinate anti-organized crime, intelligence, and information sharing. And the idea here is that a lot of these departments, and especially the municipalities, are trying to work on against criminal organizations, or trying to figure out ways that they could stave off some of these dangers, but without working across the entire route, without working across the areas where these organized groups operate. They're sort of helpless in view of the larger operations of the criminal organization. So the idea is to form public-private committees that would be government officials, intelligence officials, military officials, and police officials, along with NGOs, private citizen group that would coordinate and oversee efforts to understand how these criminal organizations are operating, and then bring together and coordinate efforts across different departments and municipalities. And third, as part of Guatemala's ongoing and prolonged efforts at the reform of security institutions, we think it's an important first step for there to be a formal definition and clear sort of public debate and then definition of the roles of the military and the police in Guatemala, how they relate, what are their authorities, and have that set before the institutional development proceeds. And I want to make a comment. All these ideas for policy are all designed to be complementary to the ongoing reform efforts that, of course, have been taking place for at least several years to reform the police, to rethink about security policies at the national level. And so we hope these are designed to be a little more short-term and easier to implement than those larger institutional reform efforts. Finally, recognizing the importance of independent, effective municipal governments for the lives of Guatemalans, in particular in terms of security, where municipal governments, as it is today, have very little sort of formal authority or responsibility for providing security. Given that importance, we suggest a significant measure of decentralization of taxes and responsibilities to municipal governments, departmental governments, to oversee security over their citizenship. And this would have to come away, this sort of decentralization coming from the examples of Colombia and other countries in the region, this would need to be implemented alongside measures to improve transparency, to ensure accountability, to improve especially citizens' access to information about spending, and so the ballot box will be a way of enforcing some of the good practices in that regard. With that, I'll conclude my presentation. I look forward to I want to thank again the comments from our distinguished commentators and all of you for coming out this morning, and we look forward to talking with you in the questions and answer period. Thanks.
Julie, why don't you go ahead?
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to make some comments in a bullet point fashion, some that are related to the report, information that's in the report, and also other points as well. I believe that there are several characteristics of these border towns that also apply to other towns within the country that are not necessarily near the border. However, knowing what the situation is in these communities highlights the vulnerabilities to which other areas in the countries are exposed, but also bordering countries. For instance, some areas in the communities in Mexico, along the Mexican border, also in Belize and in El Salvador and Honduras. I think it's important to highlight as well the concept of the monopolization of violence. What these different groups, or drug trafficking groups in particular, are doing is that they are sort of colonizing the different communities and towns and taking over the means of violence that they are now controlling. And this includes, for instance, the different gang groups. It's common knowledge that in the areas that are heavily dominated by drug trafficking, there is very little, if not non-existent, gang activity, because the drug traffickers take over all means of violence available. This also applies to the monopolization, in some cases, of the means of production. In some cases, it operates a little bit like a mafia system. They extort all the kinds of businesses that operate within the area. They don't take over the businesses, but they expect them to pay a certain amount of money of their profits. In other cases, the relationship works like sort of outsourcing. If they need certain services from certain vendors in the area for their criminal activities, then they will use them. It doesn't mean necessarily that these businesses are an integral or an important part of the drug trafficking structures. Also, another important distinction to make is the difference in the types of drug trafficking structures that operate in Guatemala. The traditional ones are run like a family business, like the case of the Lorenzanas or the Mendozas. However, there are other groups, like Ralph mentioned before, the Zetas, who are also, who are not family operated. They don't operate like a family business. One main distinction between them and the family-run drug trafficking business is that the family-run business, if you will, they use a tactic that one could describe as winning hearts and minds, like any military force would try to do in occupying certain areas. They have been operating in certain regions for years, so they have established a link with local communities. The new groups like the Zetas don't have that, and they don't have the time to create that link with the community. So whatever territory they need to take it by force. And they have done so, like we have seen in the different violent incidents seen in the country, like the case that Cindy mentioned recently, the massacre of 27 peasants in Petén. According to local authorities, it was revenge or retaliation of the Zetas against the owner of the farm because he was doing business with the Gulf cartel, and the Zetas wanted to take over the territory, or they're trying to. Another aspect is how the less resistance that the Zetas find in certain areas of the country, the less need they have to use violence. The different violent incidents that we have seen in Guatemala since early 2008 have to do with claiming territory or taking revenge due to certain aspects of the drug trafficking business. And this has happened, for instance, in Zacapa, near one of the border towns. Also, there's been another incident in Huehuetenango in the border with Mexico in November of 2008. And then the last massacre in May of this year in Petén. Another aspect to consider is the dynamics specifically in the border towns between the political power, the economic power, the security structure, and the means of communication. The type of access that the drug trafficking groups have to these 4 different powers determines the patterns of behavior that they're going to have in the community. If they have direct control to the means of violence and controlling the population, and they have their own means of income and production, then the less they will need to depend, for instance, on certain authorities or creating a relationship, let's say, with the mayor or with the local police. Sometimes the police is working with these drug trafficking organizations. I wanted to go back to something that Ralph mentioned in the case, I believe it's of Walan, or one of the border towns where the police is wary of the different operations that the central government is organizing in these areas. And this is something that was seen at least 10 years ago also in Petén in Sayakche. Before the Zetas arrived in the country, there are anecdotes where police was sent from the capital to either seize shipments of drugs or conduct searches in different properties. And after they left, the local police would end up apologizing to the local drug traffickers because they didn't know that the operation was going to happen, and they didn't know that there was going to be a major police intervention in the area. Another aspect I would like to bring up is the report highlights the fact that there's been an increase in homicides in certain areas of the country, particularly in the eastern border. And one possible reason for that is that between 2009 and 2010, the increase of drug trafficking or drug transportation to Guatemala via in airplanes decreased, and most of the airplanes were landing in Honduras. So there was a larger shipment of drugs by land by the Honduran and Salvadoran border than there was before 2009, where the planes were landing directly in Guatemala. Also, there's a large flow of guns, some from the states, other from other sources, which has increased the level of violence and homicides related to arms trafficking. Also, there is another aspect is in dealing with the problems at the border is that the fact that they're so open and there are so many blind spots and crossing spots that are not official is dealing with the habit of the communities of having free access to the border and to the other side of the border without an official structure. So in thinking in long terms or policy for a long term and how to deal with this situation, it's also important to consider that it's not only about creating better border structures or better security, but also creating policies that will deal with how people have had the habit of using the border with little restrictions. So it's about also changing habits in communities and large groups of population. So this is also a key issue to deal with. Also, there has been, there's an aspect in terms of corruption and infiltrating certain securities in the government. There's a perspective that these groups need to infiltrate the government structures, but some analysts believe that these groups think that it's not necessary to infiltrate if they can be a part of that structure. There is a whole network of people that are vulnerable in terms of corruption and being tainted by organized crime because for decades there's a habit of paying political favors for support during the elections with key positions, or even not even key positions, but mid-level, low-level, all kinds of level positions within the government, local governments and also at a national level. So when somebody gets a job because somebody else put them there, they owe a favor sometimes to these structures or sometimes to someone related to these structures. So this is another aspect that needs to be considered in terms of policy, because it's making local structures more vulnerable. And well, last but not least, there's a big concern in terms of what the message of impunity is sending in Guatemala and in the region. A lot of there have been key arrests of leaders of the Sinaloa cartel since October of last year. And although these arrests have been unprecedented, and the number of arrests has also been a big exception in terms of what we had seen in the previous 10 years, most of these arrests are of key actors in the Sinaloa group, or the Guatemalan associates of the Sinaloa group. So indirectly, this is helping the SETA structure, because I'm not saying that the government is willingly helping the SETA structure, but the fact that the Sinaloa structure has been weakened by these arrests of their key leaders is making the SETA's expansion easier, or if not less difficult. Also, the authorities, when they arrest these people, they tend to say that they are arrested because they are requested in extradition by the U.S., and there's rarely any mention of the crimes that they have committed in Guatemala. So there's a sense that they are being punished by what they did in the States, or because they're sending or conspiring to send drugs to the U.S., but they are not being brought to justice by the crimes they're committing in Guatemala. So this sends a big message of impunity to the different communities in Guatemala, and also, of course, to the organized crime groups. Thank you.
Chris.
Well, I'd like to thank Cindy and Ralph for having the State Department present today to provide some perspective on what the U.S. government views are of border security in Central America. I'd also like to thank Javier, Daniel, and Julie. They're doing very important work, and I think it's difficult to emphasize the risk people take doing research in Central America these days. Actually investigating the activities of cartels, corrupt government officials. We're seeing in Honduras many journalists being killed, and other countries as well. It's not easy work, and they provide a valuable service not only to us, but to people in their countries to show what's really happening, and to actually have the data that helps us in the policy community direct where our resources and attention go. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming today. I've been working on Central American citizen safety since 2008, and when I first started, the focus was 100% on Mexico. If you had a meeting in Central America, maybe 3 people showed up. That's changed. We never had full rooms. In fact, to find 1 or 2 programs in Central America in a year was rare. So I think it's great you're all here. Unfortunately, we're here not to talk about the remarkable progress Central American countries have made in democracy, in trade promotion, and in raising citizens beyond poverty. We're here to talk about crime and insecurity, which adversely impacts all the countries. So we're not here to actually celebrate a lot of the successes. We're here to focus on why is Central America under stress. Today I'm going to talk about what within the United States government we've done with our $360 million plus in security assistance across several different pots of funding for the 7 countries of Central America. In general, through the Central America Regional Security Initiative, we've been working to reinforce the capabilities of frontline law enforcement and security services. We're trying to rebuild the capacity and capabilities of rule of law institutions. And we're trying to actually work at the at-risk communities and youth that actually facilitate crime and insecurity in communities. And that touches upon the topic today. But today I'm not going to talk about what we do for really the police so much and a lot of the military work. I'm going to talk about really the concept of what we do with border security management and at-risk communities in the region. And unfortunately, you draft up your notes before you speak, and then you follow Julie and Ralph, and you see that you need to reorient a bit. So I'll be tweaking here and there. Hopefully that's not apparent to most of you. But what came across to me when they were talking is, in the United States, there's a concept years ago of sick building syndrome, where you had office buildings that were built and they installed the wrong carpet and you couldn't breathe well in the buildings, you didn't get sunlight, and it was really an abysmal place to work. If you look at what they're talking about today, we almost have sick community syndrome in Central America. We have communities that are under tremendous stress. And I think what we don't focus enough is the tie between border regions and the communities of people who really, they're indigenous people, they're impoverished people, they lack opportunity, although as we heard today, now they have tomatoes and other things to help bring them up. We've heard about the narco cattle, which is basically what we call them, when you have ranches where they're really landing strips and you have emaciated cattle running around under the guise of ranching. So you've got these really remote areas where there's a general lack of government presence, there's a lack of capability with the law enforcement personnel. Government spending tends to be extremely low compared to the urban cities in these regions. So we really should be focusing on these areas that are under tremendous stress over the last several years and are likely to be under stress in the moving forward. And as Julie mentioned, we're talking about Guatemala today, but from a U.S. government perspective, we have a more holistic approach. Whether it's the Guatemala-Belize border, which is under stress, we've got the Darien in Panama, which has FARC influence, but still it's the same issue of border communities that are remote, not receiving sufficient government attention. La Mosquitia in Honduras is under tremendous stress for narco trafficking, which, as Julie mentioned, a lot of the flights land in Honduras now, and they're seeing tremendous volumes of cocaine. And also we have the Atlantic coast in Nicaragua. All of these areas have significant narcotics trafficking, but also transnational criminal activities, the supporting activities for the traffickers. Excuse me. In Central America, I'm just going to touch upon border control. Many of you who have flown into Dulles Airport and you've gone through Customs and Border Protection, a lot of us see that as it's really annoying. They're going to check your passport. They're going to go through the bags. They're going to have the little cute beagle sniff your bag to see if you've got a stolen apple in there or something like that. For us, those are inconveniences. In Central America, we don't have much of that. If you've flown into a Central American airport, you've seen the best they have, quite frankly. Typically, that's where an international flight will come in. They have access to databases. There's a lot of money moving through there and trade. So there's an incentive for governments to do a lot at the airports. When you go further afield, the picture changes a bit. And I think one of Ralph's pictures, it showed sort of a river with trucks going across it. I suspect that was not a formal border port where people are supposed to go through. What we found when we've done assessments in Central America, you have extremely weak border controls, even at the ports of entry. You have, in remote areas, you have staff working in really, at best, substandard housing. You have border posts that were built for commerce that was supposed to go through 20 years ago. You have a lot of officers who have to buy their own uniforms, if that. They have lack of access to computers. General tools are lacking. So when a person goes through a formal port of entry, they might look at a passport, wave them through. They might not look at all. They have weak controls there. Where it gets much worse, though, is, and we've done this through our assessments, when you stand at the formal port of entry and you look to the left and right, 100 yards down the road, you have trucks going like this, and they're stopping for no one. And when you talk to, and this actually is quite a bit here, when you talk to the Central American officials on border management, frequently the immigration authorities are at the port of entry at a land border, and they can literally not step off the land for the port of entry to go after people they see breaking the law. That's the job of the military in most of these countries to do between the borders, or it's the role of the police to support the immigration officials when they call and say somebody's come across the border. They're extremely weak, and it's difficult to maintain territorial integrity and to reduce the trafficking across borders. The other issue that Julie's mentioned, corruption is endemic in most of the countries, as you all know, in Central America, I think to varying degrees. Some countries are better than others. In terms of immigration and customs and law enforcement in border areas, there's a reluctance to stop people. They are not going to stop traffickers in many cases. Local communities in which the law enforcement are positioned. Sorry, okay. The traffickers are trying to block my presentation here. I don't know if it'll help them or us more. But so when you actually work with a port of entry, it's literally, there's no barrier to preventing the movement of people, goods, and items across borders. And, you know, most of the items, probably 95% of the commerce, the illicit commerce that goes across borders, it's people who don't want to go through the old port of entry where it's going to take 2 to 3 hours. They don't want to pay the $1 or $2 fee. It's strictly, it's consumer commodities, and it's petroleum. It's different types of consumer goods. There's a small percentage that's probably illicit commerce. And also people who are trying to move north to come to the United States as illegal aliens, and that's an issue. One other thing, unlike the United States, most of these countries do not look at border management as an integrated government approach to securing their borders. We have the Department of Homeland Security, which actually has most of the different agencies that you need to manage borders. You've got Customs and Border Protection, which works at airports and seaports and road ports of entry to actually screen people coming in. You've got the Border Patrol. They wear the green uniforms. If you've ever watched Border Wars on National Geographic, in 1 hour you'll be educated in what we do. But they go between the formal ports of entry. You've got the Coast Guard, which is in our littoral waters, trying to keep people from coming in on boats. And you've also got Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which if people do get through, they try to capture them, deport them, and they try to identify the illicit networks that move people and things into and out of the United States. In most countries, we don't have that. You have, again, immigration, staffs the little port of entry. The military takes care of the territory in the littoral waters and the airspace. And you've got the police who kind of jump in and out, depending on their authorities. And then you have also the customs people who, frankly, in the U.S., customs is enforcement and it's revenue. Mostly it's a revenue focus in these countries, and they're not incentivized to find contraband. So we do have issues there. Very little is screened. It's extremely weak. And what it does is it actually, within these communities, allows for the free flow of commerce, illicit commerce, across the borders. What that does, though, it permits the movement of criminals into these communities, and their primary focus is generating revenue and illicit revenue for their activities. Ralph mentioned that some of them do help the communities, but they do that to further their illicit activities and their financial gains. If need be, they'll kill people. If that's what they need to do, they'll buy off government officials. They will build a school if that helps keep people happy. But these are people who are not there for the well-being of the citizens. It's for their organization, for the furtherance of their network. The other thing is they have a lot of money to throw around, whether it's, again, in tomatoes or it's something else. They buy people off. They buy communities. It really does undermine the concept of the rule of law and of citizens having a role in a community, that everybody is equal. It basically proves others are more equal than the citizens themselves. And it does further, again, corruption of officials. And a lot of people will say, well, you know, government officials, if they don't take money, they're not corrupt. Government officials take a job to do something for their citizens. So you could argue, even if they're not being paid, if they're being inactive or they lack taking action against criminals they know are there, they're de facto corrupt as well for not basically executing their duties as a public official. The other thing is we're allowing, through illicit commerce and border communities, the concept of parallel services to communities. It sets a very dangerous precedent. Frankly, if citizens are receiving their services from a trafficker or from trafficking revenues, the government has even less of an incentive to work in that community. It's sort of perverse. If health care is being provided by the trafficker, the government won't have to provide it. So it really does create parallel service delivery vehicles, and that's not good for anyone. Just to give you a quick overview of what the U.S. has done, we've actually assessed 40-plus border posts throughout Central America to try to help the Central Americans figure out what's your baseline capability, what do you need. We have ongoing discussions with Customs and Border Protection with all these countries. U.S. Border Patrol has been in most of the countries, and they've looked at these green spaces to try to figure out where the weaknesses and vulnerabilities are at non-official crossing points. We have Immigration and Customs Enforcement vetted units in Guatemala, Panama, Honduras, and El Salvador, and they're actually working to train host nation officials to learn how to identify, disrupt, and prosecute traffickers, especially transnational traffickers, for guns, narcotics, human smuggling, also what we call special interest aliens, people who have a desire to travel to the U.S. to do us harm beyond trafficking. We also have the Drug Enforcement Administration, which works on trying to actually prevent the narcotics from getting into Central America to begin with. And we have U.S. Southern Command, which is part of the Department of Defense, which does a lot of work on interdiction, training, and detection in Central America to complement what we're doing with civilian law enforcement. And finally, we have USAID, which is working in communities at risk, trying to develop, as Ralph mentioned, the need for local communities to take ownership of their challenges, whether it's security, the education of their youth, healthcare. All of these are linked. When communities feel secure, when they feel there's a competent government there, they're more likely to turn to the government to say, let's get rid of these people, to provide a better opportunity for our children. Even though they have the ability to go to school for the kids now, there is inequity and inequality created by the traffickers. It actually has certain families that are honest or aren't able to participate in trafficking or illicit activities, to see all these people who seem to be getting away with benefiting from the money the traffickers throw around, the kids get to go to public school, and it does undermine the concept of a stable, secure community. So Central America has many, many challenges. You've probably figured that out from the two other presenters so far. What we continue to urge the Central Americans to do, whether it's Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, or Belize, they have to enhance their presence in border communities. It's not just put a flag up. It's not just have a policeman there in a police car who won't leave the police station because he's afraid of being killed if he goes out and looks at the narco ranch, or he tries to go, execute a warrant to make sure there isn't a production or a transit facility there. But they also have to provide education, health care, in transparent, non-corrupt law enforcement and judicial institutions in communities, so that citizens are not turning to the transnational criminals for their services and to tend to their welfare. They have to police their borders. Everybody keeps, well, it's going to take 10 years, 20 years, billions of dollars. Every government has a responsibility to police their borders to keep their citizens safe. It's a basic requirement and basic function of government, as we do in the United States. Countries have different capacities to do this, but it's something the Central Americans have to do. The other thing is there has to be a regional approach to border management. If Belize picks up and says we're going to work to try to strengthen our borders, having Guatemala not doing its share, Honduras its share, just creates more of a challenge for Belize, and it's an inequity in Central America. And I'm glad we have somebody here from SICA to explain sort of the regional approach to border management. And finally, we need to have communities believe in the transparency and the non-corrupt officials who are in their communities. It's difficult to stress the depths of corruption in many countries. And when you get to the municipal level, when there isn't strong government support, there are a lot of government actors at the community and municipal level who want to do the right thing. But as Ralph mentioned, when the policeman is told, go do this search that originates in Guatemala City or Tegucigalpa, and there isn't a national government presence to back him up, they're putting that person in a very awkward position that likely will result in their demise, or potentially their family or somebody else through threats or coercion. So it can't just be these local communities. It has to be a heavy footprint from the national governments. So this will be a long-term government, but the alternatives to government stepping up their investment of resources, their focus on these sick border communities, the alternative is even grimmer. You'll have increasing disparities in these communities. I suspect you'll have increased violence. And you'll actually have the governments, central governments, becoming increasingly weak and irrelevant in most of these countries, in areas where, frankly, there is loss of territory. And in Guatemala, there was an article that came out yesterday saying that 70% of Guatemalan territory is no longer controlled by the central government. I'm not sure that's correct. But there are significant parts of a lot of these different countries due to sparsity of population where government does not control the territory effectively, meaning they have an effective presence that the citizens see as being there to represent them and not the criminals and not the wealthy and the elites. So thank you.
Can you pass the microphone down? Thanks.
Muy buenos días a todos y todos. Antes de iniciar mi presentación, agradecer a Woodrow Wilson International Center y al CNA por la invitación que se le hiciera a la Secretaría General del Sistema de Integración Centroamericana en compartir algunos elementos en esta exposición. Mi presentación constará de 6 puntos, algunos aportes que complementan el estudio de CNA para el caso de Guatemala, algunos datos generales de Centroamérica, la problemática a nivel regional, las acciones regionales que se están tomando a cabo por parte de los países centroamericanos, algunos elementos importantes a destacar del estudio y algunas consideraciones finales. Para iniciar con el caso de Guatemala, quisiera presentar este mapa que presenta la porosidad de las fronteras. Si ustedes se dan cuenta, aquí se marcan 16 puestos fronterizos que están formalmente constituidos contra 115 cruces vehiculares informales que actualmente están reconocidos por el país. En este caso, ustedes pueden ver, en el caso de México, se tienen 8 puestos fronterizos y 54 cruces vehiculares informales. En el caso de Belice, un puerto fronterizo y 2 cruces vehiculares informales. En el caso de Honduras, 25 cruces vehiculares informales y 3 puestos fronterizos formales, y en el caso de El Salvador 34 cruces vehiculares informales y 4 puestos fronterizos. Esto solo para que ustedes hagan o tengan un contexto de la porosidad que existen en las fronteras, y tomando en consideración que estos datos no representan los puntos ciegos que cada país tiene identificados. En el caso de los 963 kilómetros que Guatemala cuenta de frontera con México, se tienen identificados más de 1.200 pasos ciegos. Entonces esto les podrá dar una noción de cómo es que se maneja la dinámica en este sentido. Un elemento, lo que se ha dado en el país, la socialización del fenómeno de las drogas, en donde estos grupos llenan vacíos que el Estado ha descuidado. Como bien mencionaba Ralph, ya en estos grupos han empezado a construir escuelas, construido hospitales, a ofrecer seguridad a las comunidades donde ellos residen, y esto hace a que haya un incremento de una aceptación indirecta por parte de las comunidades ante estos hechos ilícitos, lo que al momento que complica cuando las autoridades quieran generar algunos programas sociales o algunos planes de seguridad, porque indirectamente estos grupos ilícitos van ganando ciertas lealtades de las comunidades a nivel de las comunidades. El tema de la internalización del fenómeno Z en Guatemala, con una clara proyección de expansión en la región centroamericana. Como ustedes sabrán, como el estudio también lo comentó, ya hay en el caso de Guatemala 3 departamentos donde está bien ubicada ya la presencia de Zetas, y pues obviamente por muchas de las debilidades que existen en los pasos fronterizos, hay un escenario de que esto también se vaya proyectando hacia los otros países de Centroamérica, uno con un objetivo de posicionarse y tomar territorios, y por otro lado agenciarse del negocio en su totalidad y no tener intermediarios para estas acciones ilícitas. Asimismo, el involucramiento de las maras en esta actividad de narcotráfico, más que todo en el Triángulo Norte, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, donde hay mayor presencia de maras, y obviamente esto tomando en consideración que las maras se han involucrado y tomado como punto de actuación algunas rutas que está utilizando actualmente el narcotráfico, y también el tema de extorsión a las rutas que están siendo utilizadas por los inmigrantes. Para entrar al caso de Centroamérica, que es donde nos corresponde a nosotros, comentarles que la región está integrada administrativa y políticamente por 8 países, por Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica y Panamá, y en el caso de República Dominicana, que es un estado asociado al sistema de integración centroamericana. Hay proyectado una población de 42.8 millones de habitantes en toda la región centroamericana. La Secretaría General del SICA, como encargada de coordinar y facilitar diferentes estrategias y acciones en materia de integración, y esto tomando en consideración todos los ámbitos que para la región han sido priorizados, tomando en consideración aspectos de medio ambiente, temas sociales, temas económicos, y ahora que ha tomado auge el tema de seguridad por la situación que está caracterizando a la región. Algunas problemáticas a nivel regional. quisiera dar a conocer un dato que ha dado la Organización de Naciones Unidas sobre una totalidad de 29.3 homicidios por cada 100.000 habitantes. Esto les ayuda a ustedes a tener un contexto de la gravedad del problema que está teniendo la región centroamericana. Muchos producto de la presencia de narcotráfico y otros por algunas características internas de cada uno de los países. Dentro de las amenazas que la región ha priorizado está el tráfico de drogas, el tráfico de armas, la presencia de maras o pandillas, el tráfico y trata de personas, la porosidad de fronteras, el robo de vehículos y el sicariato y extorsiones. Y otros problemas en fronteras que se han identificado por parte de las autoridades e instituciones que se encargan de los temas de seguridad fronteriza en la región ha sido el tema de tráfico de maderas, contrabando de gasolina, el contrabando de huevos, contrabando de licor, contrabando de cigarro y contrabando de medicinas. Asimismo, es una notable insuficiencia de la infraestructura con la cual cuentan los países en los puestos formales y legalmente establecidos. Hay un entorno de las aduanas que es vulnerable. Alrededor de las aduanas ustedes se darán cuenta o podrán ver que hay una serie de ventas, una serie de mercados, cambistas que están en el entorno de las aduanas, y esto obviamente pone en vulnerabilidad y en riesgo la información que se maneja en las aduanas, pero también limitan a que haya un control adecuado por parte de las autoridades que tienen funciones y competencias en la misma. Las zonas fronterizas que han servido como soporte y albergue de indocumentados, esto tanto por centroamericanos, pero también se ha logrado identificar otras nacionalidades que utilizan la región centroamericana para poder pasar por México a Estados Unidos, y esto más que todo se da en la frontera de Guatemala-México por ser esta la que está más cercana a Estados Unidos. Un hallazgo, de acuerdo a reuniones que hemos tenido con los países centroamericanos, es que dentro de los sistemas de operativos migratorios, cada quien tiene sistemas diferentes de manejar la información, y al momento de querer tener algún intercambio de información en términos operativos, esto es limitante porque obviamente los sistemas no son compatibles. Otro hallazgo también es que no existen patrullajes conjuntos y combinados. Se ha dado y se ha notado que hay poca comunicación entre autoridades de varios países, no hay una comunicación fluida y un intercambio de información, y por ende esto limita que hayan buenos resultados, tomando en consideración que es una amenaza que es transnacional y por ende todos tienen que unificar esfuerzos. Hay una falta de mecanismos de intercambio de información y de inteligencia que ha sido notorio. Otro elemento es que Centroamérica dejó de ser solamente un puente para el tráfico. Ya Centroamérica está teniendo problemas de consumo de drogas, van en incremento en la región centroamericana. En algunos de los países, para el caso de Guatemala, pues hay un incremento en la producción de amapola y marihuana, precisamente en la zona fronteriza con México, y esto pues denota que ya no solo es para el puente como se establecía en años anteriores. También uno de los problemas que inciden bastante es la permisividad que hay en cuanto a la legislación existente de aceptar la aportación y tenencia de armas por parte de los ciudadanos. Esto hace a que se cree un ambiente y un clima de violencia, porque cualquier problema lo resuelven por medio del uso de estas armas, y esto hace, como les enseñé en la gráfica y la afirmación que hace Naciones Unidas en su informe de desarrollo humano, el alto porcentaje de homicidios por cada 100.000 habitantes. En algunas de las zonas fronterizas se considera el contrabando como una actividad económica. No lo perciben las regiones fronterizas como que si sea un acto ilícito, y bueno, esto a la vez conlleva que no haya una cultura de tributación, porque a pesar de que se consideran como actividades económicas, también son de la percepción que son economías informales, entonces que a la vez no tienen que pagar impuestos, y esto hace a que la cantidad de delitos o problemáticas se vaya incrementando. Siguiente, por favor. Aquí una reseña de los puestos fronterizos que existen actualmente. Hay 6 fronteras internas en Centroamérica, una frontera trilateral que está formada por Guatemala, Guatemala, Honduras y El Salvador, que es considerada como Triángulo Norte, y 2 fronteras periféricas, uno tomando en consideración la frontera Guatemala-México y la otra Panamá-Colombia. Aquí una breve reseña de la evolución que ha tenido la narcoactividad. Actividades que inician desde 1960, pero que para el año 2000 al 2011 ya sean actividades como puente, consumo, acopio de droga, lavado de dinero, ya sean actividades de sicariato, donde se matan entre organizaciones criminales, pero en muchas ocasiones también muere gente inocente que está en medio de estas acciones. La producción, como les comentaba, en el caso de amapola en Guatemala, el caso de marihuana también. El tema de la interrelación con otras actividades del crimen organizado, o sea, la interrelación que también existe con temas de tráfico de armas, en algunas ocasiones utilizando algunas de las rutas que sirven para el tráfico y trata de personas, que esta es una problemática que a nivel centroamericano se está sufriendo bastante. Y en el tema de tráfico y trata de personas, pues problemas como el tema del aumento de esclavitud de centroamericanos, el tema de la venta de órganos, que es un tema que no se ha abordado mucho, pero que es una realidad que va en incremento. La presencia de grupos armados en la región, precisamente por esa permisividad que hay en poder utilizar armas de diferentes calibres, hace a que ya sea común ver en las calles gente con fusiles y armas ofensivas, lo que también crea un clima de inestabilidad y un clima de inseguridad por parte de la población. El tema de la socialización, que era lo que les comentaba, estas organizaciones criminales han logrado llegar a las necesidades que las poblaciones tienen en el día a día. Algunas acciones regionales, comentarles que existe un mecanismo de libre movilidad que es conocido como el CA4. Esto hace a que los controles migratorios sean mínimos con el ánimo de influir y tener efectos positivos para lograr la integración centroamericana. Este mecanismo está siendo utilizado por Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras y Nicaragua. También se tiene el tema del libre tránsito de mercancías, que con la visión de poder llegar a una unión aduanera, actualmente 5 países son miembros de este mecanismo, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, y a este se suma Costa Rica, que si bien es cierto son 2 acciones que han mejorado para crear mecanismos de regionalidad y de inversión en la región, también han sido actividades que el crimen organizado ha utilizado con el ánimo de llevar a cabo acciones ilícitas. Entonces es la evaluación que se hace, ¿verdad? Por un lado tratando de llevar a cabo acciones para mejorar la integración, pero por otro lado también el tema de los controles que a veces se ven vulnerables porque los grupos ilícitos se aprovechan de esta dinámica. También existen acercamientos extrarregionales de los países del SICA. Recientemente se llevó a cabo una reunión con CARICOM para compartir diferentes criterios y experiencias que se están viviendo en el tema de seguridad. El Caribe es una región que también ya está empezando a tener afectación en los temas de seguridad. También el SICA mantiene diálogos en materia de seguridad con Estados Unidos, con México, con Canadá, con Colombia. Y precisamente parte de las experiencias y las buenas prácticas que se han llevado y obviamente por el tema de la cooperación que se recibe. Comentarles que en junio se llevó a cabo la Conferencia Internacional de Apoyo a la Estrategia de Seguridad, donde hubieron más de 54 delegaciones entre países y organismos internacionales, en los que se manifestó la voluntad política de los países centroamericanos en priorizar las necesidades y las vulnerabilidades que los estaban afectando y presentar las necesidades de cooperación que se tienen en la materia. En este se involucró al sector empresarial, a sociedad civil y al poder local, tomando en consideración que son actores fundamentales para que hayan resultados positivos en la región. Sociedad civil por medio de las diferentes propuestas que puedan tener, y el sector privado pues es un actor fundamental que participa en cada uno de los países. Comentarles también que ya hay una visión por parte de los países, por un lado, de fortalecer los puestos formales que están constituidos, pero también ya voltear a ver y empezar a generar acciones para fortalecer la presencia del Estado en los puntos donde no hay, pero también ir generando medidas de confianza entre países para este intercambio de información. Comentarles que en el marco de la estrategia de seguridad, misma que se divide en 4 componentes: la combate al delito, el tema de prevención, el fortalecimiento institucional y el sistema penitenciario. Y para el tema de combate al delito, en el caso de México, Estados Unidos y Colombia, pues han ofrecido asistencia técnica y cooperación. De hecho, dentro del proceso que se encuentra actualmente en la región, en la formulación de los proyectos que se están realizando, son países que han tomado liderazgo en esta temática. También comentarles que actualmente la Unión Europea está apoyando los temas de seguridad fronteriza de la región centroamericana. Se aperturó un programa de seguridad fronteriza para América Central, CEFRO, que toma como referencia el modelo que se aplicó en Europa respecto a la gestión integrada de fronteras, donde pretende tener una coordinación y generar mecanismos de coordinación entre aduanas, policía y migración. Obviamente esto por mecanismos de interconectividad y utilizando a un actor importante para la región como lo es Interpol, que tiene una subregional en El Salvador. También se están llevando acciones en el marco del proyecto de coordinación interinstitucional y regional para la seguridad fronteriza en Centroamérica, que es uno de los proyectos de los 22 que se presentaron en junio. Y dentro de las actividades que se han identificado es crear comisiones nacionales para asuntos de seguridad fronteriza, y eso para tener resultados en 2 niveles. Uno, a nivel nacional, donde se necesita que haya una mejor coordinación entre las instituciones que tienen funciones y competencias en la seguridad fronteriza, y por otro lado, acciones que logren generar mecanismos de coordinación a nivel entre países. Esta comisión es una de las prioridades que los países han determinado para esta temática. Asimismo, contar con un diagnóstico sobre la situación actual de la seguridad fronteriza desde un enfoque regional. Según reuniones que hemos tenido y algunos acercamientos, ya cada país tiene determinados, identificadas cuáles son sus necesidades, cuáles son las rutas, cuáles son sus prioridades. Ahora es de tener un diagnóstico regional que nos permita profundizar en las acciones y actividades que se tienen que realizar para que hagan los resultados que se necesitan. El tema de establecer lineamientos estratégicos y un plan operativo en materia de seguridad fronteriza, esto trabajo en el ámbito de la Comisión de Seguridad de Centroamérica, que es el mecanismo que funciona a nivel centroamericano en términos técnicos y políticos. La adquisición de equipos tecnológicos, informáticos y de comunicación, que es un ejercicio que cada país está realizando actualmente para identificarlos y poderlos poner en el proyecto que está por finalizar y ya presentarse a los países, al grupo de países amigos en la última semana de noviembre de este año. Establecer puestos de control y vigilancia en pasos no controlados. Desde la perspectiva de prevención también se están realizando acciones. No solo se está visualizando la mejora y el fortalecimiento de las fronteras desde la perspectiva del combate al delito, sino que también ya se pretende dar una visión de prevención desde los gobiernos locales, la formulación de agendas locales desde la perspectiva transfronteriza, formular políticas públicas locales y transfronterizas en prevención de la violencia y la delincuencia, tomando en consideración que son los alcaldes quienes están sensibilizados y saben cuál es la realidad en las diferentes temáticas. Y aquí pretendiendo ver el tema de las fronteras, si bien es cierto desde la perspectiva de seguridad, pero también irlo viendo desde la perspectiva de desarrollo, que es fundamental para los resultados que puedan haber. La fórmula que se está pretendiendo, mejorar los mecanismos de intercambio de información, poder tener mayores recursos para poder invertir en estas zonas fronterizas, mayor tecnología para el tema de los controles y operativos coordinados entre las diferentes instituciones de los países. Algunos elementos que quisiera destacar que son importantes, que salen del estudio de CNA. El estudio sirve como un parámetro para tener claras las causas de los problemas y no tanto los efectos, que es por lo general donde los gobiernos visualizan estas problemáticas. Es importante poder replicar este tipo de estudio con profundidad en otros países de la región centroamericana, ya que permitiría tener claros los estados de situación de las fronteras. En el estudio se propone como un eje fundamental la voluntad política y la transparencia del Estado, que es fundamental para este tema, poder incrementar la presencia donde no ha habido en las diferentes regiones, pero aquí de la mano también tendría que ir una concientización por parte de los ciudadanos. Como ustedes vieron en la foto que mencionaba Ralph en su presentación, en ocasiones hay un claro rechazo por parte de la población de aceptar los planes y políticas del Estado. Ahí aparecía en la foto de que no se acepta el ingreso a instituciones estatales y eso marca un claro mensaje. En ocasiones no solo es que los gobiernos quieran tomar el control e implementar medidas, sino que también hay una aceptación y a veces estos pobladores se acostumbran al dinero fácil. En muchas ocasiones las poblaciones habría que analizar si quieren cambiar el ingreso que les deja, por ejemplo, un cultivo de amapola en sus terrenos, al contrario, un cultivo de papas que se les pueda ofrecer el gobierno en un programa de cultivos alternativos. O sea, a veces no solo es que los estados tengan la intención, sino que sea aceptado por las poblaciones. Algunos hallazgos que como producto de estos estudios se pueden dar. Si bien es cierto, se estudiaron 3 municipios de un mismo país, ustedes se dieron cuenta que tiene cada uno su particularidad y obviamente al momento de tomar decisiones y acciones va a tener que ser de acuerdo a esas particularidades y no una fórmula general. Ahí, por ejemplo, el hallazgo de que en una de las zonas fronterizas indirectamente el tema educativo ha incrementado, es un hallazgo que es interesante saberlo con este tipo de estudios. La implementación de políticas públicas integrales, el fortalecimiento del poder local, que era lo que les comentaba en mi slide anterior. Algunas consideraciones finales. Para la región centroamericana es fundamental la ejecución de la Estrategia de Seguridad de Centroamérica, la cual fue presentada en junio del 2011. Algunas alianzas estratégicas que se puedan tener con diferentes actores, con diferentes países, con diferentes organismos internacionales que trabajen en la materia y un tratamiento del tema de seguridad fronteriza no solamente desde la perspectiva de seguridad, sino involucrar factores sociales, factores económicos, factores políticos y también el tema de desarrollo, que a manera en que haya desarrollo habrá seguridad en las zonas fronterizas. Yo con esto dejaría mi presentación. Muchas gracias.
Thanks to all of the presenters and especially to CNA for having undertaken this incredibly important study that, as Chris mentioned, is undertaken at some degree of risk by people, Julie and others, who have continued to investigate these themes. I'd like to take a series of questions. I'd ask you to wait for the microphone and to identify yourself. I'd like to ask the first question. We'll take a number of them and then turn back to the panel. Guatemala has the second round of its presidential elections this coming Sunday. Both candidates have pledged to use mano dura to increase the state's effort to combat criminality. There's some question about whether or not both candidates, but particularly former military Otto Perez, who's leading in the polls currently, would use the Guatemalan army as part of this fight. So my question is, what is the role of military institutions, and to what extent are the institutions at the national level, not just the local level, penetrated by organized crime? What can be said about that? I'll go around. Sure.
Yes, Jim Michael. I'm a consultant in
And a former
development.
Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere.
Things.
Right.
The vulnerability of the local communities to the power and influence of these criminal elements suggests that part of what is missing is support from the national level. And Guatemala in particular has a history where previously the monopoly of violence was the army. And the presence of civilian institutions from the central government, ministries of agriculture, education, health, social services of one kind, hardly visible. And so now you have these communities that are weak and vulnerable, and you don't have the army anymore, and that's a good thing. But you don't have the support from weak central governments with limited budgets and limited capacity and limited infrastructure to get out into these remote areas. And it seems to me there's something missing, and I didn't hear much about that aspect of a strategy of strengthening the capacities of civilian elements of government. I'm thinking, in our own history, it wasn't the Chicago police that arrested Al Capone for throwing people into the Lake Michigan, but it was the federal government coming after him on tax evasion. And, where's the central power element in accommodating or compensating for the lack of capacity and the vulnerability of the local communities? A related question is, what reaction did you have from either central authorities or from the communities to the recommendations for policy that are set out in this report, which are very interesting, but I wonder what was the perspective of the Guatemalans who have to live with those recommendations if they were adopted. Thank you.
Anybody else? Two over here. Start with the woman in the back.
Reiko Ishihara from Dumbarton Oaks, Harvard. One missing piece that I thought out of all the speakers today was, and it seems like always the case with illicit trafficking, this topic of illicit trafficking is, I'm an archaeologist, and so for me it was very interesting to see that one of the case studies was at Sayashe, because that's where we were actually based out of to do our archaeological digs. It seems that the missing piece for me is the trafficking and actually the excavations of antiquities, cultural patrimony. And this is a huge issue in Guatemala and throughout the Maya region, where U.S. is one of the major markets. So I wonder if you could speak to that and see how this larger drug trafficking network is related to the issue of antiquities trading. Thank you.
Okay, and then just pass the mic down.
I'm Carla Barquero. I'm with the Permanent Mission of Canada to the Organization of American States. I just wanted to get back to the issue of social capital. Looking at the three case studies, it seems as though there's not only an issue of the monopolization of violence, but also the monopolization of governance in some of these areas, particularly locally. And it seems like we've talked a lot about, in the press about narco states, but it seems like there's also narco towns that we're creating in some of these regions. My question is, when we talk about, the Zetas versus some of the more local Guatemalan organized criminal trafficking groups, is there a way that we can build social capital in the communities where there are foreign organized criminal networks like the Zetas to build on that capacity to show confidence in government? Is there a way of increasing social capital in one type of case and seeing how that would apply to some of the other local communities that you've looked at?
take comments back from the panel. Who wants to start?
Well, I'll take a couple of the easy ones, and I'll leave the rest to some of the members of the panel. And I also want to pass the word as well to Danny and Javier whenever they're willing, because they, obviously they especially on Cindy's question, they are the experts, and I am certainly not. Regarding the reaction in Guatemala to policy recommendations, we are having a workshop in which we will, similar to this one, which will release those policy recommendations at the end of the month. So we do not yet have those sorts of reactions. Maybe Danny could speak to what he thinks will be the reactions, or in his own discussions with government officials on these recommendations. But to my knowledge, we don't have any such reactions just yet. On the issue of social capital of how can social capital be built? I think there is some positive work that's been done on the capacity of towns to build social capital, even within 4 to 8 years. Not at least in some of the research on this, it hasn't been done in Central America, or hasn't been researched in Central America, but in Southern Asia, for example, there are instances of addressing income inequality, of progressively boosting citizen action through municipal support, as I mentioned, for various types of programs, in which this has generated a demonstrable, even measurable increase in the number of people participating in dialogue, number of people participating in voting and economic activity then around the voting in some communities. So there is hope to do so. It's not a near-term process, and part of the difficulty in these towns that weren't faced in the case studies that I'm referring to is that you're doing so, I hope, conscientious of the security situation in an area in which security poses a real threat to the citizens. So to mobilize and to start discussing citizen security and the role of the police and why is it that we have the señores and not a functioning police can be very dangerous. So it has to be done, in a way that's kind of conscious of that. Now, this does occur, and I'll pass again the microphone to a Guatemalan guest to speak of where this has been done in Guatemala or where it has been improved. But it is one area that we are trying to look at. What are some policies that can be done in the short term at the local level to actually address this, and it's an area of prospect, I think.
Yes, Julie, go ahead.
I could talk on a couple of these points. The first of which, in terms of where you were as an archaeologist, the Department of the Interior has been working in the Mayan biosphere in a very successful program, which in fact speaks to the whole lack of a federal government. In order to protect the wildlife, there were a lot of macaws being poached, and I think it's called the King's Road, I forget the term, for all of the archaeological sites in that area. The local community sort of banded together and said we need to keep traffickers out, we need to reduce transit routes, and they put up with local police, and eventually the Army went in to help them, roadblocks to see who's coming in, to reduce the theft of wildlife and archaeological remains, and actually create a tourist-based economy. And our Department of the Interior, actually, in a unique program funded by our Agency for International Development, is doing work to build local governance, to help train the police, to teach them how you police and archaeological preserve. And frankly, there's a U.S. interest, because when they light the fires up there, the smoke goes all the way to Houston and actually causes delays at the airport there. So we're doing work in that area, and that's really locally driven by the community recognizing that they can't necessarily count on the central government. They have resources that they can not exploit, but use to create wealth in the community, and they're doing that very effectively. So we are working on that. In terms of items being smuggled out, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement frequently interdicts, because traffickers are moving all types of things now. They've diversified beyond narcotics. They do get antiquities frequently, and they're trying to focus a little bit on wildlife trafficking originating out of parts of Guatemala, also Belize. In terms of what's the role of the military, that's always a tricky question in Central America. They don't have the best human rights records from the civil conflict periods. Fortunately, those days are over. Trying to find a credible violation of human rights by a military in Central America is quite difficult these days. that is actually government-controlled or a government-ordered execution of some sort. We continue to work with Central American governments to encourage them to build the civilian capacity of their law enforcement services. Narcotics trafficking, organized crime are not military problems. Unfortunately, their police have been underinvested in for decades now. They have no equipment to speak of in many cases. They don't have the training. Their salaries are low. The military are being called onto the streets of a number of countries, and Belize even. You have the Coast Guard out in South Belize City and San Salvador. You've got police presence that's been there for several years now. Guatemala, you're starting to see it, and also in Honduras. It should be temporary. It should be well-targeted, and as we tell the Central Americans, the military role must be subservient to the civilian law enforcement authorities. Civilians must see the civilian police as the lead in preventing crime. If the military is there, it's a secondary role. Otherwise, what you do, when we're starting to see in polling in El Salvador, is putting the military in places that typically aren't actually that violent makes them look successful, and the police, who are in really hard areas of cities, have a problem, and they're not as successful. So people actually lose confidence in the role of the police, and they look at the military as, why don't they have a more active role? That's not the solution. So strategically using the military in hotspots under the control of the police, while focusing on building the police, so in the future the military polices the borders but not cities, is what we're striving to work on. In terms of the question about where's the central government, you know, a lot of the leaders of Central America are smart. They went to school here. They know what they have to do. As Secretary Clinton keeps telling them, you can't have tax rates that are below sub-Saharan Africa. You need to build your... She doesn't say it that way. She just says you have to raise your taxes. Kevin Casas-Zamora at Brookings keeps using the sub-Saharan Africa quote. But, I mean, you've got tax rates which are just too low to support government spending in countries that have massive social needs for citizens, grinding poverty. You've got food insecurity. They need to raise revenues. They need to move resources out of the big urban cities where a lot of the voters are, quite frankly, and address these rural communities and build the social fabric and the government institutions that are sustainable. But they know what to do. I mean, it's just, do they want to dedicate the resources to do it? And if we have narcos providing the services, there isn't an incentive for them to do it. So.
Your microphone, I think, está funcionando.
Sí, solo con respecto al tema de fortalecimiento institucional, la estrategia es bastante amplia, la estrategia de seguridad de Centroamérica, y sí está contemplado el fortalecimiento de las diferentes instituciones en materia de seguridad. Ha sido una de las prioridades de la región, tomando en consideración los entes de investigación, policía, Fuerzas Armadas, porque se toma en consideración que los resultados se tienen que ver desde una visión integral y no solo se quiere o se pretende fortalecer solo a las policías, que así es, el Poder Judicial también, la Administración de Justicia, es una visión integral que está teniendo. De hecho, en la Comisión de Seguridad de Centroamérica, en un inicio solo participaban fuerzas de seguridad y fuerzas armadas, y ahora un actor fundamental son los entes de investigación que ya son parte de la Comisión de Seguridad. Son avances que se están teniendo en la región y sí viéndolo desde una dinámica integral. Gracias.
Let's take a question here from Eric. Actually, Eric, if you don't mind, I'll start. This gentleman had his hand up before in the last round.
My name is Gregorio Meraz. I'm correspondent for Televisa News Network from Mexico. I would like to ask you, we can see that in this case there are two different approaches. While the drug smugglers are going to the communities and trying to help people and gain their support so they can hide them. In the other hand, you have the authorities that usually use the deployment of troops, which is an intimidation act, and usually they incur in excessive use of force or violations. Do you think this may be the cause for which in places like Mexico this strategy is not working as was expected? And in the other hand, are you seeing in Guatemala the type of executions that we are seeing in Mexico, horrendous executions like beheadings and dismembered?
Eric.
I have a question, if I can.
Oh, sure, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Luis Alonso with the AP. If you could please, anybody could elaborate on how whoever wins the election, how how important that new president will play a role in this all horrendous panorama you guys have been describing. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Olson with the Latin America program here at the Wilson Center. Two quick questions. One had to do with the social capital question. I might have missed this, Ralph, but I thought, at least in one or two of the examples, you suggested that they, in fact, had social capital, priests who were active and so on. So I wondered how that squared with the idea that somehow social capital was a bulwark against organized crime, because there are cases, and especially in Mexico, where you have a lot of social capital and still they're there. So that was the question. But my bigger question was about the issue of borders. And I know that nobody came out and specifically said borders will solve this problem, but there's an implication that the borders are broken, the borders are part of this problem, and we focus a lot on that. And I wonder sometimes if we don't fall back on this kind of old idea of borders, that somehow manning the borders and fertilizing the borders are going to solve the problem of organized crime. And more we're seeing that that's actually not the most effective way to do it. I'm not suggesting that you just have open borders. Obviously, that would be ridiculous. But what is the relative importance of borders in this bigger picture? Because the U.S.-Mexican border is, the most sophisticated and fertilized border, way more than anyone in Honduras or El Salvador or Guatemala is ever going to have. And organized crime still gets through. There's tremendous trafficking going back and forth. I wonder if it's the best use of limited resources. Maybe one alternative would be to focus on the two external borders, Panama, Guatemala, and Mexico, rather than try to fertilize all these internal borders that are extraordinarily difficult, very expensive, and probably a very ineffective use of resources.
Okay, there were two people in the back, this gentleman at the end of the table, and then the woman behind.
Hi, Julio Rank from the National Endowment for Democracy. I had a question with regards to some of the expressions that you mentioned that these border communities were making, like the narco bueno and narco malo, or even this idea that education levels are rising, so, somewhat implicitly, well, there's some social benefit of these groups operating. I'm just wondering if that is just a reflection of a growing sentiment, not only in Guatemala, but regionally, that the drug problem should be sort of diverted to the U.S., and that the policies of mano dura haven't been working either in Mexico or in Central America, and therefore it's an issue of consumption, and we should just simply, turn the blind eye and let the drugs flow, because as in the initial round of elections, several candidates in Guatemala said, ya estamos poniendo los muertos. We're already providing the dead, so let them handle it. And I'm just wondering if you sensed this idea of a growing sentiment in Guatemala in general.
And right behind you.
Hi, Stephanie Molina with USAID. I am curious to hear if any of you know of any prevention programs or any programs being implemented by AID or the EU or other international cooperation arms that maybe having an impact, but at a small scale and need to be replicated or scaled up, or anything that you have seen that is working. And it doesn't necessarily have to be on the social side, or programs by DOJ or other investments that foreign governments have made that may be actually working at some scale.
In turning back to our panelists, I'd like to recognize Danielle and Javier first and see if they have any things that they'd like to contribute on this. Sure.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I would like to add to 4 different issues. First one, the role of the army, and what are they going to do, Otto Perez or Valdizón? My answer would be, and I think Julie can help me with this, who knows? We have no idea. You guys don't know how lucky you are that you get to know your candidates and the policies they're going to implement and all that. We have no idea what these guys are going to do when they come into power. We have no idea. You talk to them, they all say very broad things, very not very concrete. Especially Otto Pérez he's not very concrete. I think Valdizón is different. He is concrete, but he's no coherent. And at first he was running as like the right wing of the Patriotic Party. Once he gets to be a front runner, he changes completely his speech, and he starts talking about what the army did and how human rights and all these things. He is a manual case of populism. He's just so flexible in what he says. I don't see much of a substance there. It's a good thing that we can be talking, or we can talk about the role of the army, because it has to play some role, and it's not very clear. In a technical sense, that's a very good thing. But I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know where they're heading. About empowering local governments or institutions. What we thought, precisely because of the case of Malacatán, where we saw there was more social capital, there were more actors, and we thought that it's better to have presence of the state, but through local governments. Local governments just get 10% of the budget, and 90% goes to the central government. But the central government, in most of the areas, in all the areas we studied, and I would say most of Guatemalan areas, has not a great deal of legitimization. Like it's people don't believe in central government; they do believe in local government. The thing is, they don't have the resources. How can we help with this? Well, we've been discussing quite a lot about this proposal of federal fiscal federalism, that is, to give the capacity of local governments to collect taxes. And that capacity is going to make the relation between the social actors and local governments stronger. Because when you have someone getting money from you, you expect that guy to give you something back. And that's not what's happening now. I think we have very good examples especially in Guatemala City and in the suburbs of Guatemala City. There's a very interesting case. It's called Santa Catarina Pinula. There's a mayor called Tono Goro. He just got reelected for is it fourth time, Julie? Third time. With a 65% approval. His budget went from 6 million quetzals. I was just talking the day after yesterday with one of his advisors, to 140, because he was able to collect the taxes over the price of the land. And with all those resources, he's been doing a great deal of things. And people are very, very happy with him. And I think that could be a very good way of strengthening the presence of the government through local institutions. About the elections, it looks like Otto Pérez is going to win. He's 45-55. Again, who knows? Because the polls didn't quite get it the first time. Otto Pérez had a 52% in some polls approval, and then when in real life, in the first term, it was more like 36%. But I would say that I would say it is Otto Pérez who's going to win, and probably Valdizón is going to be very well positioned for the next election. It's kind of a law in Guatemala. The second one in an election becomes president in the next election. It happened with Arzu. It happened with Portillo, with Colom, and if Otto Pérez wins, it's going to happen to Otto Pérez. I think that's it.
I'd like to add a little bit to that. In terms of strengthening local governments through taxes, another component that needs to go with that is fighting corruption. because even with the little, and of course not in all of the municipalities, but in some of them, or a significant number of them, even with the little resources they have, there has been little control from the central government on how they're collecting taxes. And in some cases, because of the connections between local authorities and drug trafficking or organized crime, this makes it even more difficult for the government to make them accountable for whatever money they're not spending well, or not using for legal means. There have been even cases of threats from the mayors to the local or to the state authorities in charge of monitoring how this money is spent. So one has to go hand in hand with the other. Regarding the presence of the central government or the central power, one of the objectives after establishing, or rather before establishing the International Commission Against Impunity, was that there also had to be institutional strengthening. So local institutions would take over after the commission is gone. However, one big problem in Guatemala is the short-term idiosyncrasy. Everyone wants results overnight. So having the need of different number of communities to satisfy their basic needs, this need goes over the long term. So if the central government or local governments try to cover these needs with programs that are not going to be long term, it's only going to make some of the organized crime groups look better because they have been doing it for longer than, or they've been satisfying some of these needs in some communities for much longer than the government has. So this is giving some of these groups more legitimacy than any of the local governments or the central government has. The other item is, in terms of the social capital, like somebody was commenting a little earlier, it's just as strong as the security or the means of a security structure, because you can have a strong community and strong leadership, but if they are facing armed groups that they cannot fight with, without having a local security structure, then the social capital can only go so far. It needs to have an infrastructure in terms of security and support from the local government. Also, regarding the role of the military, one needs to consider what happened during the conflict and the role of the army in the conflict, but also the fact that some of the infrastructure that was used for counterinsurgency purposes is now also being used to fight organized crime on one hand, but on the other hand, it's also serving organized crime. So this makes the role of the army very complex, and it can't be seen as an indivisible unit. You have different factions within the army, some fighting organized crime legally or through illegal means. Others are working or being accomplice to these structures. One problem with the previous governments and the current one, it seems, is that the army is being used in a fashion, I'm going to call it a band-aid solution. There hasn't been or there doesn't seem to be a long-term strategy, and long-term in terms of years, like 5-10 years, etc., to use the army in combination with the police. It's like they are sent in combined patrol units with the police to certain areas, but there aren't enough resources to fight the problems that they're facing. So the success of the use of the army by the next government will depend on how it's integrated with civilian forces in a comprehensive strategy over the long term. If it isn't used in this way in a strategy, it's not going to be that effective, or it will in the short term, like the state of siege that was imposed in Petén or Alta Verapaz. But after they leave, then the old problems are going to return. And there's a belief that because of Otto Pérez Molina's military background, that he might give more support to the army in terms of resources, but it's still not clear how he's going to integrate the civilian and the military forces. What some analysts have criticized, that although the army is being used to fight organized crime, along with the police, there isn't a real integrated central command where both the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Defense are taking decisions. And the government says they are, but there's a question on how long-term they're based and how integrated they are and how much resources they have. There is little hope for now for the police reform. The head of the Commission for Police Reform has said many times that there isn't enough budget to fund the police reform, and without the proper budget, no police reform can be carried out. And this by itself dooms every security scenario in the country over the short or long term, because the army can only go so far. And my last point is that I think it's wrong to consider that either the police is good and the army is bad, or vice versa. You have bad and good elements in both. It's just how both are being used in a strategic fashion that's going to lend the right results over the long term. Thank you.
Just a couple quick points. In terms of the graphic violence, I think one issue, it's in Central America, the media has a responsibility to be responsible. The graphic violence you see in the newspapers in Central America highlight, as they do here in the U.S., but less so, just the violent nature of the crime. I think one of the issues we've talked to Central American governments about, they need to do what Colombia did, which is to sort of strategically communicate with citizens that they are actually making progress as well. I know the Colombian police, at the high point of their violence, had a strategy of, for every picture of a body in a ditch or somebody who was robbed, they'd try to get 7 stories out of what they were doing to help instill confidence in the citizens that the police were actually making a difference that was visible. So I think it's difficult to say, graphically it is as bad as Mexico. But is the level of violence as bad? Probably not in certain circumstances. But the media does have a role in trying to look for the other side of the story, and the government has a role in communicating that. In terms of Eric's question about the borders, I mean, you can't throw up your hands. That's the easy answer. It's the cheap one, too. And I think many countries in the region, it's been a hybrid approach. I think what we need to look at is, in addition to strengthening borders, it does something else. We have to focus on trade facilitation. A lot of these people who are actually not using formal border points, it's because it's too slow and they're paying high fees. But when they go through the illicit ways, and again, they're moving toilet paper or Coca-Cola, they're actually at risk in paying other people fees as well to transport it. They're paying traffickers or local gang members or leaders to move it across. So there is a valuable role in deterring that, if you at the same time try to facilitate commerce for the vast majority of people who are just trying to move small loads across borders. And then it allows the police to actually focus on who are these other people who don't want to go through the checkpoint. So it serves 2 purposes. So you need to look at it not only from the law enforcement, but trade facilitation. And I think a lot of governments haven't done that. But they should not try to extract very high customs duties on consumer commodities from people, charge fees for people to cross a border, and actually try to work with the process. So there is a revenue generation capability there also that would offset maybe some of the costs for going after people on the borders. And then the question from my AID colleague, too frequently the U.S. government is asked, what are we doing in the region? And you mentioned the litany of actors we have in Central America. Frankly, what we've mentioned to the Central Americans is this is a partnership. We are there to supplement what they are doing that's working. So I'd turn that around to you, and I think there should be more studies done in terms of what the Central American governments are doing to help their citizens. And those are the areas we should support and supplement as we're doing. But specifically in the Bataan, we do have a program that's being worked with our Department of Defense and AID to help provide some hardened courts, we call them, where you can actually provide justice with vetted judges in a hardened court environment where they have access to justice very quickly within the 24-hour window in Guatemala. Otherwise, they're released. We're trying to provide some community development there also in the community to try to provide alternatives to crime. But again, the limit of international donors in the United States, it has to be to supplement what the host governments have to do. The cost is enormous. It's long-term. We can be there to help provide best practices, but again, these are issues host nations have to deal with, allocate the resources, the political will, and the attention to help these communities.
I just wanted to ask you, regarding the policy of mano dura against that has been used by the government, do you think they will need to replace it for some other policy that allow them to recover the confidence of the population? I mean, some policy that can compete with the policy of the cartels trying to help the community.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't focus on the name of the program. What the Central Americans need to do is to develop they have to develop the crime plans they communicate to their citizens. And I heard comments, civil society has been involved in a lot of these discussions. We don't think that's the case. We think civil society has a greater role to play in working with government, whether at the national level or municipal level, to actually have the citizens say, here are the challenges, have the government say, here's how we're going to do it, and it's a partnership. Too often the citizens blame the government for doing nothing, but they don't take ownership of their part of the problem. And too often the central government doesn't go to the citizens and say, if we do this, will you support us? So what we see as crime prevention has a component where civil society, the private sector, which frankly pays too much for private security, and some of that should actually probably be spent on strengthening the police, need to come together as a government, as political parties, as community leaders and civil society groups and private sector, determine what the country needs to move forward, develop the strategy that, as Julie mentioned, most countries don't have, that integrates how will the civil society groups play a role, what will the role of the military, the police be, and all the other actors some of you have mentioned in terms of the ministries of education, ministries of welfare, job training. All of this has to fit together to do prevention, the enforcement, and the post-prison rehabilitation of people who have had to go to prison, that they have an alternative to crime when they come out. So I don't want to focus on the term. It gets, mano dura gets too much attention in Central America. The issue is, what are the strategies governments and the citizens are developing to solve their challenges? That's what we have to focus on.
I'd like to make a couple quick points, if I may, in response to Eric's question on social capital. Social capital, of course, is a difficult, fuzzy concept to work with when you're addressing these sorts of issues. And we had several back and forths about the different levels of social capital we're observing in the cases. For example, in the argument could be made that in Guatemala, the relationship between the community and the señores, and the understanding that some sort of stability is going to be provided if it's only communicated to them what the needs are, and if they, there's some communication and mediation that takes place. Well, that's a form of social capital. It's not publicly mobilized. It's sort of a clandestine or quieter form of social capital. We come back forth what that is, and same thing with the Chamalé case. The more Chamalé and his group was actually present and public in the community and giving to local organizations, well, is that a form of social capital? You use the term is social capital treating as a bulwark against criminal organization. I think that's the wrong type of concept, or I'd at least use a sort of metaphor, and that is social capital is sort of either a resource base or an instrument by which the community is more resilient in the face of these challenges, in the face of local criminal organizations or the intrusion of criminal organizations. It's certainly not a bulwark. It's more, say, an absorptive capacity to respond, to have a public voice, and in particular, as the case in Malacatan sort of indicates, what's especially effective, and as the panelists have said now several times, when you have a state presence that is open to communication with the civil society, and in addition to a civil society, then you can see how the social capital, if you will, operates not to stop drug trafficking, because it's not a security presence. It doesn't have a local police. It's more a matter of mediation. Part of the work, part of what we drew upon in the study is the work of Desmond Arias, who talks about mediation between crime groups and local communities and associations in the favelas of Rio and in certain regions of Colombia, and he kind of goes into this concept in similar to the way we're treating it. And it's a dynamic that can exist if you have social capital, if you have that capacity for mobilization. When you don't have it, it can't exist, and then you get sort of a situation where the drug traffickers just do what they wish and they buy off systems. I think another important concept is that of independence. So in Gualan, you may have social capital, but the social capital is bought and monopolized by the drug trafficking group, even within the municipality, within the government. Whereas an independent social capital source in Malacatan is better able then to mediate because it's independent of the other interest groups. I want to go back very quickly to another point made on the cultural patrimony issue. In other work that we've done at CNA regarding the building of security capabilities in the region, not just in Central America, but across Latin America, issues like cultural patrimony, environmental resources, conservation of local natural resources, disaster response are all areas in which states and governments can promote and work with the militaries and their security forces, can build the capabilities of militaries to provide security in a way that is less confrontational and doesn't raise the sort of specter of military action and military capabilities that many of these countries have, many communities have. So it's an interesting, and I think Chris's response is kind of along these lines, like this is an area in which you can get the community involved, and the community can feel this is a security area in which I see a return, and disaster response is a very important area as well in this. The communities see militaries during disasters as their best friends because only the militaries are able to go out there and work with them and reach them and help them. So helping militaries define their roles within civilian governments to address those issues, not drug trafficking perhaps in these towns directly where that's a very sensitive and dangerous issue, but talking about, well, what can the military and security forces do for you in protecting these other areas or responding to other types of security, that doesn't set off the alarm bells. And you can begin to work that way and reach out to the community and build sort of public support and public coordination that later will evolve. It is still improved capabilities and improved capacity, improved communication and intelligence within the community and a presence. But it's a different way. Looking at those issues is kind of I think it's a positive exercise in thinking about how to address some of these issues in these places.
Julie.
I just wanted to add a little bit more to the comparison between the Guatemala and the Mexico situation in terms of violence. I think it's the Guatemalan situation hasn't reached the levels of the violence in Mexico for two reasons, or two among several. In the case of the Zetas, they have in Mexico they don't have as much freedom as they would have in Guatemala, or at least they are not being tackled as in such a frontal manner by the military as they are in Mexico. Also, they have more groups in Mexico to fight, like other drug trafficking groups, to take over territory or certain trafficking routes that they don't have that kind of resistance in Guatemala. Therefore, there's less need for violence and confrontation. Also, the cases that you've seen in Guatemala are fewer because of these reasons. They have tried to fight certain groups or killed people in retaliation for certain situations. Now, regarding the assistance of foreign assistance programs to help get the communities out of involvement with drug trafficking, I thought of one example in particular that I think displays how little the support of local government is intervening. This is like 2-3 years ago in the Pacific. There was a fishing project that was sponsored by a foreign mission. And I don't remember if it was U.S. or European right now, but they had managed to have the fishermen in a certain village stop working with the drug traffickers and get involved in the fishing project. However, sometime later, I don't remember for months or longer, the drug traffickers threatened the fishermen to leave the project and go back to seizing drugs. They were going in their boats and seizing or intercepting the loads that were dropped in the Pacific Ocean. And eventually the program had to be closed, and they moved on to another area of the country to help another community because the fishermen started leaving the program and went back to the drug trafficking activities because they were coaxed by the local trafficking group. And in this case, the support of local government or the central government was non-existent. They were left to fend for themselves.
Okay. Any final word from the Sure.
Yeah, just to insist a bit on a couple of issues. Something I didn't say before was this distinction between narco bueno and narco malo. You know, and this has been a very solid, constant issue in the field research. Everybody in every town we interviewed was talking about these guys are good guys, the other guys are the bad guys. You know, so before you were asking about how we can build on that. I think that's a very important issue, and I think it's a great opportunity that institutions, especially from the security central government, should capitalize in a way, communicating to the communities and saying we are the ones fighting these bad guys is a very important issue. And collecting data from them, that's a main problem from the central government doesn't have the right information of what's happening in Guatemalan territory. They have no idea. Maybe local officials have, but public servants from the central government don't have the information of who's who, how he or they operate, and et cetera, et cetera. So it is a very strong issue. And, well, something that Christopher said before, there's, I think it's because of Hillary Clinton, Secretary Hillary Clinton, going in June to Guatemala, and I think you know quite a lot about that speech, and saying that we need to collect $3 for each dollar that the United States gives. There's and I think that this is a very, very positive thing. There's very much talk about how we are going to reform the fiscal system, how we're going to try to collect more taxes. That's why I think we should not only talk about how much we're going to tax, but how we're going to do it. Because one of the main problems of the fiscal institutions is they're very weak, and again, they don't have the information. I would say local officials do have the information of who's who in their communities, so maybe they can help or be in charge of collecting those taxes.
I think we're coming to an end. I'd like to thank our panelists, Ralph, Chris, Julie, Werner, Danielle, Javier, for this study and for the conversation. We especially thank CNA for the study that it's put out. All of us will be looking forward to its publication and its availability. I'd also like to thank Adam Stubbitz of the Latin American Program, Elizabeth Malkin, an intern with us, for their help in putting this event together. Just a quick sort of public service announcement. Next Wednesday, we will be hosting a meeting on money laundering in Central America, a study published by a network of Central American research organizations known as La Red. Among those joining us will be the former Vice President of Guatemala, Eduardo Stein, who is the coordinator of this network of think tanks throughout the Central American region. We have a number of resources that are available on this issue, as I mentioned earlier: Organized Crime in Central America, a paper by a former public policy scholar, Townie Adams, on questions of chronic violence and precisely what long-term impunity does on citizenship and on the possibilities for creating and exercising social capital. So two resources that you should find on our website. If you're not on our mailing list and you heard about this event through Ralph, please make sure we have your business cards. Please join me in a round of applause to thank our panelists.